about learning outcomes. And the reason that we spent so much time on learning outcomes was that specifically for online courses, they are one of the main components to set your students up from the start on the right foot with the course, and communicate your expectations to them, make sure they understand exactly where they're going and why. So here are our learning outcomes once again for the total online course design intensive as a whole. The same ones that we were showing yesterday. Today we're going to talk about 3 and 4. So talking about designing assessments that align with your course learning outcomes, and then talking about different sorts of instructional strategies that are going to maximize student engagement. All right, so Kim's going to take it away for a while to talk to you guys a little bit about alignment.
Yeah, so some of the terms that we'll be using here just to operationalize or make the common knowledge ground here for the foundation. An assessment is any assignment that you give to anyone that you grade. It doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of points. It could just be something that you do a check marks, did they do it or did they not? So things like a paper, things like a quiz, those are assessments. And alignment, we're gonna further talk about alignment here because I think that we instructional designers throw around the term alignment a lot, and I think we assume that we're all on the same page, and maybe we're not. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more now. So alignment is the idea that everything is communicating with each other in your course. So the main 3 things that we have here are learning outcomes, assessments, and instructional strategies. So I like to think of this as a stool. So the learning outcomes and the assessments. So we worked on learning outcomes yesterday. So, those are the kind of overarching end result that we're hoping for. The assessments are the things that can tell us whether or not our students have achieved the learning outcomes. And the instructional strategies are the things that can enable our students to get to the assessments to be successful in the learning outcomes. So it's the planning here is backwards, right? So the learning outcomes usually are the last thing that we think of, right? Like usually it's all the fun stuff like the activities and the assignments that we're going to give people. That's completely the opposite direction that we want to go. So the learning outcomes is like the ultimate goal. Assessments are how you know they've achieved that goal, and the instructional strategies are the supports that get them there. So think of these as 2 bookends, right? So your learning outcomes are on this side, they're at the end. The assessments are here, and then what can we do to get them to those things? All right, so these are kind of the terms that you will often see with the alignment part. So learning outcomes. So students should be able to, we talked about these specific, measurable from the student's perspective yesterday. We looked at them through SMART, which I think is really nice, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Assessments. So again, thinking about assessments and how can we make this really clear for our students. So in an online class, like how this is different from maybe an in-person class is that the clarity, the expectations have to be set from the very beginning. Rubrics are a great way to do that with assessments specifically. So they set expectations. They don't necessarily, okay, don't ignore the language on the slide. It helps us to work towards objectivity. So it's not necessarily an assurance of objectivity, right? Because I think it's hard to remove bias completely from our own experiences, but it does help because there are certain criteria like each criterion is laid out very specifically with kind of benchmarks for each point. And then it helps us work towards more equitable grading. So instead of letting our biases totally take control over what decisions we make in terms of the grades that we assign to students, there are some standards that we have already set in place which hopefully remove some of the bias that we experience while grading. Instructional strategies are the things that you give to students that like activities. We've got these peppered in everywhere in our own workshops that you'll notice today. So the instructional strategies that we gave you the Miller reading. That's something that helped you perform or do the assessments, feel confident moving towards those. So readings and resources as well as different activities too. So if we think about them as a stool too, a three-legged stool. So if you've got, all of these things are communicating with one another. So I want my students to be able to create a marketing plan. The assessment is they have to create a marketing plan. That's the assignment. And then the instructional strategies are, readings about what a marketing plan is, case studies, things like that. That's an example of the stool. If, let's say, we had the learning outcome create a marketing plan, and the assessment was an exam that talked about what a marketing plan was, then we're out of alignment here. So you're not actually seeing whether or not your students can create a marketing plan. You probably are assessing whether or not they can describe a marketing plan, whether they can identify the key components of a successful marketing plan, but you're not asking them to create necessarily unless you have an essay question in there. So things can be changed and flipped in ways where we're no longer assessing the learning outcome of the course. And so if we think about that as a stool, so the assessment, if the exam was a multiple choice exam, then our little like leg is a little bit lower, and then you're kind of sitting a little bit strange. So a lot of the times when students don't understand the utility of something, or they think something is busy work, this is where they don't see the link between the learning outcomes and the assessments here. It could be that that's not made clear to them at the beginning, or that there's a misalignment and so they don't see the utility in it. Sorry about the audio. I think it is trash day today, so you might hear a beeping in the background.
So so Lynn mentioned in the chat box that if you had an exam talking about the components, right, it could be a stepping stone to getting the tools, getting the knowledge, practicing, putting all that together in order to later create a plan. So Lynn, yeah, you are correct in that. So that actually feeds into what we'll talk about in like a minute, with formative and summative assessments and sort of benchmarking and scaffolding, which Kim mentioned yesterday, sort of prepping them to get the tools that they're going to need and the skills.
The scaffolding too. So we talked about kind of course level learning outcomes and how we talked about weekly learning outcomes. Absolutely. So the weekly learning outcome you can assess in the exam for a stepping stone. Absolutely, Lynn. That's a really good point. It would be very difficult for a student to not have practiced some of those things prior. You just throw them in and say, okay, create a marketing plan, but they don't have the appropriate kind of foundational knowledge that we talked about with Bloom's taxonomy. So you're asking them to do here, but maybe they haven't developed these skills down here. So this is going to be extremely challenging, more challenging than normal. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Cool. So the next bit. So thank you, Lynn, for directing us here. The next thing we're going to talk about is the different types of assessments available to you. So you've probably heard of formative and summative assessments by now. Most people have who are teachers or instructors. So we're just going to go over it very briefly. And we have this kind of cutesy little cartoon on the side here, but that actually really, really describes the difference between formative and summative assessments really well. So we've got this quote: when the chef tastes the sauce as he goes, it's formative assessment. When the customer tastes it at the end, it's summative. Okay, and that's the main difference here, right? Formative is sort of as you go. We're testing things, we're getting information, gathering all of that data, and then making some kind of decision about it one way or the other. And then summative is something that happens essentially once at the end. So your formative assessments are sort of the low stakes things. They're things that you're going to pepper throughout the course to help both you and your students, right? They help the students to identify different strengths and weaknesses they have related to a particular skill or a particular topic. And they help you as the instructor to also see what is going on with your group of students. They tend to be, I think I said this already, they tend to be low stakes, and we're going to get you guys to give some examples of what that might look like in just a minute. Summative, on the other hand, are a little bit higher stakes, right? So it's typically a sort of one and done deal. It's something that's going to evaluate student learning at the end of a particular point in time in the course. Maybe it's at the end of a unit or a week. So it looks like something maybe like that test that Lynn brought up that would measure the student's ability to understand what even goes into a communication plan. Or it could be something that's measuring a course level outcome at the end of the course, like their final project might be to take everything they've learned and create that marketing plan. So these are the summative assessments are the ones that really are directly tied to a learning outcome, particularly somewhere else in the course, whether it's unit level, modular level, course level. The formative also still need to be aligned, but they aren't necessarily always as directly tied to a course outcome. So basically, one more thing about summative is that it is kind of, you're measuring at that point in time with a summative assessment, the skills and behaviors and tasks that you told your students that you were going to measure at the beginning of the course. So, here we go. So we wanted to get your input. So again, as I mentioned before, it's probably not the first time you've heard about formative and summative assessments. So we wanted you guys to take a little bit of time and think of some examples, maybe examples you've personally used before, that of formative assessments, those that kind of are going throughout the course of a course and measuring student progress and helping them get feedback. And then the summative ones that are really the endpoint of measuring student learning on a particular topic. So if you remember from yesterday, at your bar across the bottom, you should have an annotate button. It might be hidden in your more menu, but there is an annotate function available to you guys. And if you choose the text, you're able to type. Yeah, here we go. I see some people filling it in already. So take a couple of minutes and think of some examples that you've used before. All right, it looks like we're just about full up on the table here. So let's try and review some of these. So I'll start with the formative. I'm going to read some and then delete them. So there's, nothing personal here, but I'm just going to try to clear it up so we can read it a little bit better. So let's see. We've got one here asking my students to define the main schools of thought in U.S. foreign policy. Okay, so something like defining or identifying is a good kind of formative thing. You can see at a glance what they know, what they don't. Lab assignments are good, right? They're learning the different skills and kind of building from week to week or however periodically they're given. We've got chapter quizzes. One-page papers based on class lectures, take-home essays, in-class group work is a good one. So the activities that you have your students do that aren't necessarily maybe for a grade, even those can be really good indicators to you of how your students are getting along with a new topic or new skill or new material. All right, so I'm going to delete some of these so I can move the others. All right, I've got in-class writing reflections. We've got practice problems, open-ended questions. Good. Another one, open-ended questions. Homework. Role-playing is a good one. Okay. We've got simulations, kind of goes along with the role play. Chat rooms, because that creates a log for you also, depending on the tool that you use. Journals in general, right? So having them reflect on their learning process. Group work, having them discuss typologies and Blackboard and doing a quick presentation to the class. That's a good formative assessment. Module assignments, the component of which will be used in a final project. Good. Having check-ins for a term paper. So I saw this somewhere else too. So kind of having an outline or a proposal somewhere along the way is a good way to kind of make sure your students are on track to do a good job with their final paper. All right. And then on the right-hand side, I will try to move some of these, but my computer is unhappy again today with this.
You want me to jump in and talk about some formative things while it's loading?
Sure.
So the key things that I think of when I'm thinking of formative assessments, a lot of you already put this as like weekly things that you're checking in. So like minute papers and those exit slips that a lot of you have already said like, that you're doing. Those things are really good formative assessments. Really good so that students can see where they're lacking in maybe knowledge, and you can also see too, okay, they didn't maybe pick up on this component here. A lot of you too talked about the scaffolding part. So you have a term paper, so that's the summative part, but then you've broken down the different components of the term paper. So like, let's see, annotated bibliography, intro, methodology, stuff like that. Those can also be formative assessments because then you've got input and feedback provided to the students at each step of the way for their paper so that when they do turn in the final paper, they've got a lot of feedback here, which is really, really nice. And you can still grade each of those components too. Formative assessments don't necessarily mean that they don't receive a grade, right? They're just not these things that are kind of these collective components that kind of close the door on a specific learning outcome or multiple learning outcomes.
All right. Good. So taking a look at the right-hand side then with the summative examples that you guys came up with, again, it's a little hard to read, but what we see a lot here is tests, exams, final exam. We've got final papers. We've got essays. We've got research papers. All of these sorts of things. These are good ideas of summative assessments, right? Where they're taking everything, it's a cumulative project. Whether you do those sorts of formative check-ins or not, that end result is a very good example of sort of a culmination of what they know and what they've learned. So those are good examples. I'm going to delete some of them to clear this up. So we've got a group work with final paper can also be a good option. Okay. Ay, ay, ay. So let's see. See if I can get this slide back up. Sorry about that, guys. It worked so lovely yesterday morning, and now it's just, okay, what other examples do we have over here on the right-hand side? We've got journals. So you could also use a journal potentially as a summative assessment. Final exams, tests. We've got student presentations is another good one. So especially depending on your learning outcomes and the types of things that you want them to do, potentially do communication type things, a student presentation is also a good option. All right. So we've got this one down at the bottom here. So synthesizing ideas and concepts is another good example. So I'm going to clear all of this and get us back to the right slide here. There we go. Okay. All right. So I think, Kim, I'm going to throw it back to you unless you have anything to add about summative assessment.
No, I think Suzanne asked a good question in the chat here about a continuum for formative assessments and summative assessments. I think that that you have to determine what the end product is, the summative part. I think that, looking at the course level learning outcomes first and the summative assessments will probably help figure out what is a formative assessment along the way. Again, like if you have a literature review component of it or something, that can also be, worth 20% of the grade, right? But thinking about the end result, I think will help to organize your thoughts along the way. And then work backward towards the, for the timeline there on that. Does that help? Also, I think this is a good opportunity to say whenever you want the technology to work, it never does. So remain calm. It's okay. There are lots of different things that happen here. Most of the time, our students are pretty understanding of this, as I think all of you are about this too. Things happen, right? Just make a joke and move on. Every time Ashley and I present, there's always like some technological thing. So I'm not even fazed by it at this point. So
Kim, it's Kamal again.
Hi, Kamal.
Very interesting you said that, because the Miller article basically says that that's one of the major problems of online teaching.
Mm-hmm.
You recall. I mean, he said sometimes there's a crash, sometimes there's no electricity. We know, we don't think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Anything could happen. It's a chance you take. And it happened to me actually during the transition period when the system crashed and I had to call in the help desk and there was no one to answer the phone. It was very embarrassing. So I had to do something really creative. So I had to actually record something and then just put it on Kaltura Capture the next day. And it worked. It was
good.
fun.
Good. Yeah. See, it's there are so many more variables that affect kind of our interactions online than there are in person. Think of different plans that you've got, so my backup plan was that I was going to share this, and a different backup plan was we were going to just show the slides not in presentation mode, right? Like, it's okay. It's totally fine. You might have seen the next slide, so we might have given away some information, but I'd rather you see the information than we hold that, in the back of our pockets. Yeah, Christian, you have a hand up.
That's exactly.
I was also going to share, like Kamal, a similar experience. I had a guest speaker and her computer crashed.
Oh, no. Yes.
So I gave the students a break while I talked to her on the phone and fixed things up. And then we came back in 10 minutes and it was fine.
Right. Yeah.
But I think the point that Kim was raising, Christian, is that we should have a backup. Just in case something happens, we should know exactly what to do at that moment. And I think that's really a great point, Kim.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, we had planned a break anyway, so we just moved the break forward.
Yeah, you know, when I was on the phone and the instructional continuity support thing, you know, it's basically turn it off and turn it back on, right? Like the easiest tech fix that you can do usually is the best one. Yeah, awesome. So moving forward now, so student engagement is something that I think a lot of people are very concerned about in the online space, particularly with asynchronous discussion. So things where there's not live components. So, you know, there are things that affect student engagement. And so knowing the things that affect student engagement can help us to decide and make decisions about the plans and the course design for our own courses. So we're going to talk about that there. I noticed in the chat here about, I'll keep moving. So one of the main factors that affects student engagement is student motivation. And I think, so this is taken from How Learning Works, 7 Research-Based Principles for Smart Teaching by Ambrose et al. And so, you know, you've got different components here within this matrix that we can affect 2 of them, but we can influence the other one. So the things that really affect motivation here for an online student are the environment, value perception, and self-efficacy. So the environment and the value pieces, we can control quite a bit of it, but the self-efficacy part we can influence, but we can't control. So firstly, so the environment is supportive. So things like the language that you use, you know, I'm looking forward to having you in this class. You know, you know, the slide that we had, we're trying to create at the beginning, you know, how it said like, we value your knowledge and we want you to bring your knowledge too. We're trying to create an environment that is very supportive so that you feel comfortable here. That is something that the instructor sets the tone for, right? So from the very beginning, from the very first moment that we work with students, this is where we can start to build that foundation, where we have a safe space that's an environment that's supportive, right? The value, we've talked a lot about value already, actually. So value and relevancy. So a student's perceived value of a specific learning outcome or anything like that. I think Samuel yesterday brought up the fact that they have their students pick a learning outcome and then they relate that learning outcome to their lives. So what's happening there is that they're starting to see value here. And relevancy, like what does this mean for me? We are inherently curious and focused on what it means for us. That's just kind of how we operate here. We are also situated too. We are situated within this reality. And so we're trying to figure out what all of these pieces mean for us and how they can affect us later or now. The self-efficacy is a really interesting piece because, you know, a student who believes that they can achieve the things that they want to achieve in the class has very high self-efficacy. We can, you know, I'm sure that, you know, the math professors and the statistics professors and research method professors have seen a narrative where students have said, I'm not good at math, therefore this is going to be really hard for me. And so their self-efficacy is very low. But what you can do, so you can't control that, but you can influence it, right? You can say, all right, you know, math is really accessible. Think of math as a game. Think of the things that, you know, what things that you can do, what are the things that was like your proudest moment for math? Like, what were the things that you just really were excited about, right? Like, student self-efficacy is very, very, very important. So as we work through today's block, I want you to think about these different factors. So the environment, the value, and the student self-efficacy, so that when we move through these things, you're starting to think about these things, the language that you use, the way things are set up, things like that. Yeah, self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is a student's belief that they can achieve the grade or the level of performance that they want to achieve. So if a student says, I don't think I can do this, then it's going to be low. In How Learning Works, they provide an example of a professor who says, at the very beginning of the class, sends an email and says, you know, only 5 of you will get an A in this class, and there's 20 people in the class, right? And so a lot of the student self-efficacy plummets because they're like, well, why would I be one of those 5, right? Not that any of you do that, but I had a professor when I was in school that said that, and I was like, why would I even try, right? Like what, you know, there's so many people who are smart in here. Why would I, you know, are hard workers, so it doesn't even matter. So maybe don't do that because it affects the self-efficacy piece here. Does anyone have any questions on that before we move on?
My former intern just became CEO
Kim,
of
could
Devils.
you define self-efficacy again?
I'm sorry? Say it again, Lizzie.
Could you define self-efficacy again?
Yeah, self-efficacy is a student's belief that they can achieve the level of performance that they want to achieve. And then there was someone else who was sharing. I just heard somebody else.
I think that was my roommate. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. Okay, everyone is good on this? Okay, so let's talk about student engagement now here. So when we look at the, you know, the factors that affect student engagement, like the motivation part, you know, we can start to design a lot of our communications around that, our communication plan. But then when we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of planning out learning outcomes and assessments particularly, we can look at flows of communication and collaboration. So when we talk about student engagement, what are we looking for here? When we talk about participation, what are we looking for? Evidence of the student's involvement and engagement with the content and material in the class, right? We want to make sure that a student is present, that they are wrestling with the things that we want them to wrestle with, that they are trying to make connections in their minds between concepts and their own lives. And so this is a model that I've created that talks about the different flows of communication and collaboration, how we can actually start to parse out and figure out, you know, where these interactions are coming from here. The flows of communication and collaboration, when you want to maximize student engagement, it helps to have multiple different flows. So I keep using our workshop. I'm not trying to say that this is the paragon of excellence. I just have an example that's right in front of me here. So you've been interacting with us quite often today. And so that would be a student to instructor relationship, student to instructor flow. We had you write on the board that we had here on the different slides. That would be a student to content, student to instructor, and maybe student to student. And then we had you yesterday think about your own learning outcomes, and so that's student to self. So there's 4 different flows: student to content, student to instructor, and student to self. When you start to think about the different assessments that you have and the different, you know, formative and summative assessments, start to think about the different flows. Humans are inherently social creatures. We are very social beings. The online environment is a very strange thing that has happened in the last, I don't know, decade, 2 decades, right? We're trying to figure out what that means online. How can we then create relationships online so that students feel that the environment is supportive, that they have an environment and a community to work within here? And looking at the different activities and assessments that we have, these are a really good way to kind of formulate the different flows here. Discussion boards are a really good example of the flows here. So that would probably be student to content and student to student, right? So we're trying to replicate that in-person relationship that we have between them. And if, you know, when I'm in a discussion board, I choose to not be involved. I want the students to really be involved on this conversation. And so I am not necessarily a factor in this. So student to instructor is not part of the discussion board, right? Okay, let me go through some of the group chat questions here that you have. Let's see. Joseph talked about giving the survey on Blackboard. That's really cool that it looks like Joseph is trying to create a supportive environment that's like, tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me something really cool about yourself. And to date, his students have identified 104 languages that they speak. That's incredible. That's amazing. That's so cool. That they feel like they have this community there to write the welcome in the languages that the section speaks, that it's in each of the languages is really, really cool. I think that's a really nice way to kind of position the semester here. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. So asking the students what grade they will expect in the course, I think that asking that question might help with self-efficacy if you ask them why they think they're going to get that grade. I don't know that students really understand or know what kinds of things get them the grade that they want. A lot of them think that spending hours and hours in the library reading things is what will get them the best grade, right? Maybe, I mean, if that seems to work for them, you know, working hard and determining that kind of reflection there, I think is a good question to ask too. Talk about dealing with student biases coming into the class. Yeah, so something that comes up very frequently when Ashley and I talk about this is the gendered aspect of women, particularly, who are coming into a classroom and who are a lot more nurturing, let's say, and a lot less formal than perhaps male counterparts or male presenting counterparts. That's something to think about for sure. I think though that making the decision from the very beginning about what kind of classroom that you want to have, it doesn't support, I don't want you to think too that environment means that things have to be fluffy. Things don't have to be like, you can do this, you've got this. No, it could just be like, all right, if you study this, this is, you know, you'll be prepared for the test. It's the same kind of sentiment, but it's not as like informal or fluffy, or, you know, that's kind of where I would say with that. I don't know, Ashley, if you have anything to add to that.
I think it's true. I think you can still keep people on topic and keep people sort of, I think you can be encouraging and motivating to your students without having to let them like step all over you or anything like that. I think it's maybe a little bit tricky, but I think it can be done. I see some raised hands. Does anybody want to speak? I don't know who it is.
Todd and Lynn. Todd, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. I guess the question that I just posed on chat is the one about the relationship between self-efficacy and expected grades. And more specifically, to drill down, I think that they are entirely dependent, their self-efficacy is about what they think their grade's going to be. And I want to know what tips you guys have for separating those. I think a good one that you suggested was taking the learning outcomes and having them project them into their lives. That's a great idea. I never thought of it. But what else?
Yeah,
and
so yes.
Online, I mean, I'm going to be very candid. I mean, I think that, you know, for undergraduates, online now is kind of this obligation that they're not that happy about. I mean, regardless of the potential for online learning, I mean, this may be the elephant in the room, but you've heard this before, I'm sure. Most of us really don't want to do it. I mean, that's not what most of us do. Some of us do, we do it really well, I'm sure. But I don't know how many I speak for, but I expect I speak for most of us. And I think the students feel the same way. And I think that frankly, in the fall, we're going to enter a situation where we're going to be lucky if we get 80% of the registered students now, because, you know, it's going to be a drag. So how do we give them self-efficacy in this time in particular on online learning when they're not that interested, when they were looking forward to coming to college, to like being in a dorm and hanging out with all their friends, and we're not about, you know, the Hollywood Squares approach either. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be critical. We're trying to make the best of it. You guys are doing a good job, but in general, I think it's a question that may be on our minds.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fair. I don't think that's originally what a lot of us signed up for. I think it's an adjustment of what we're expecting, right? And you're right, it's the reality, so we're working towards that. I think the conversation and the question that you asked, Todd, really points to extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation are the things and the factors that affect motivation that are external. So things like grades. And intrinsic motivation is like, oh, this seems like a really good skill that I could have. This seems like something that would improve myself, you know, my abilities here. And so I think that a lot of students are very used to having extrinsic motivation. Students are really used to being, you know, having this external thing tell them, all right, you need to do this because you need a good grade, or you need this because your next job is going to need this, right? So I think that starting from the very beginning and trying to convince them that, okay, tell me a little bit more about why this would be important for you. And don't tell me it's because you want a good grade, right? That's fine. I mean, logistically, that's what a lot of students are worried about, particularly at AU, right? I think that asking the student to connect their lives and, you know, what are the things that might make this useful for you, and really shift them, try to make this a paradigm shift moment. You're not going to do it on your own. This is going to take some time. But if we have a different conversation from the very beginning to try and turn their brains in a different direction, that will help a little bit with the extrinsic part. And you know what? I think that students are pretty resilient. This is hard for everyone. And I think that, you know, we're going to try and design classes that make them feel as invited and welcomed as possible, even though this isn't like a typical experience that maybe they originally signed up for. I think all of you are in the right place to be talking about these things. And
can I say something? I think what Todd is saying also, that look, we are going to be challenged with having the students registering for these types of courses, because online is just really shifting their paradigm. And at times I heard this during this transition period, that a lot of the students are tired of it, and they're so fatigued. They just, how do you motivate them to sort of continue to focus, say in the fall, if this continues, to continue to want to register for online courses when they are really themselves are skeptical, not just us as faculty members, but from the perspective of the students? How do you really get them to understand and agree that this is really a wonderful medium of the future?
I think if I may, okay, go ahead, Robert.
I'd suggest that we name this issue in the beginning and have a discussion with people in the class. They know it, we know it, and for many it's a pain in the ass. So they would rather not be doing it. So naming that and saying, okay, here we are together. I'm doing this to try to make it great for you, to help you do what you need to do. I need some help from you. What can we do together to make this the best possible experience for all of us, so that it's safe to say it sucks?
Yeah,
I think there's nothing wrong with being honest about that. You know, to Todd's point, none of us really, you know, I'm sure many people would rather be doing what they were doing before. You know, the students, us, the whole world pretty much would rather that this had never happened. But I like Robert's point of, there's nothing wrong, I don't think, with being honest and being like, look, we're going to try to make this the best out of, you know, kind of make, what do they say, make lemonade out of the lemons that we've been given, and try our best. And I think too that this points back to the chart. If I could pull this up, this whole thing has been fussy today. Okay, so pulling back to this chart and talking about the value. So I think if you have activities and have outcomes and all of the pieces of your course design that signal value to the students, and maybe it's something like Samuel had talked about yesterday, actually making them point out the value to themselves. And then you're starting them off from the very beginning about, how can I use this? What am I motivated to learn? What am I excited to get out of this class? Because if you do have things that they can't see the alignment with, or they can't see the value in, they're not gonna come with you on this journey, right? They're not gonna be a willing participant for this. You know, as I mentioned yesterday, I had this online course this course I was auditing, and when we switched to online, all we did was talk about our feelings every week, and I stopped going, honestly, because I wasn't getting what I wanted anymore from the course. I wasn't learning things. So, you know, I think that tying it back to this value is a good way to try to get them internally motivated as much as you can, and try to get them on board with you and going on the journey with you.
I want to make sure that Lynn is able to participate here. So go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, thanks. It's kind of frustrating when you have your hand up. So I guess I want to go back to that point because I'd raised the question about gendered issues and also, intersectional issues regarding, gender, race, all sorts of paradigms and biases that the students actually bring in. Mm-hmm. And my concern is that, I appreciate saying you can have the environment so it's not, soft and that sort of thing. But students bring in the expectation that if a female professor, for example, isn't all like, hey, kind of softer and that sort of thing, they kind of have problems with it. And so how can we create or have the students check their own biases? Because they're very quick to check ours, but check their own at the door and to say, listen, the paradigms you have about female professors, about professors of color, professors of other diversities, is that they are checking that as well, because sometimes I think they don't think they have those biases, but they bring them in and it does affect the dynamic of the classroom or how they're evaluating things or how they're viewing learning and knowledge, because two professors can do the same thing and a white male professor gets viewed much differently than a female professor of color.
I have some ideas, but I want to hear from other people too. So does anyone have anything that they do that works to have students check their biases at the door?
I mean, I would say, having been an AUX adjunct, that there are some role-playing and some other activities, exercises that one can get from AUX2 that would be helpful. I don't remember them specifically because I taught last year, but they were extremely enlightening to the students when they took them, when they realized, oh, older adults aren't the only ones who have unconscious biases. So that's my suggestion, is maybe reaching out to Izzy Stern and the folks at AUX too.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. I think a lot of times that students just don't know that they have them. So pointing them out is a good strategy, for them to kind of situate. The other thing too with novices is that they have a hard time connecting concepts from one class, one kind of bucket, if you will, to the next bucket. And so a lot of the times the transfer isn't quite there. And so reminding them of that and maybe using some of the exercises that AUX2 uses is a good strategy. Was there someone else who had something?
Yeah.
Yeah, Randolph.
Right. So I think the way we're talking about checking your bias at the door is as if it's like a backpack you have and you put it down and you go in there and you're all cleansed and open-minded. Students who have been socialized just like everybody else for 18 years into all kinds of biases. I mean, this is an ultra-rationalist sort of like a marketing. You're buying something or you're not buying it. It's a choice. I want the biases in the class. What am I there for other than that? That they bring different bias doesn't mean that it's nasty. I mean, somebody could prefer absolute free market. Do we tell them to check that at the door versus somebody who, say, is more Keynesian in their approach? Or people have political biases. I want the biases in the class. And there are other things. If asking someone to leave their prejudice at the door doesn't work. If it did, there'd be no need for any of us doing this.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologize for that. I think I simplified what that was by saying checking your biases at the door. That's a good point, Randolph. Yeah, it's very complicated and we've all been, conditioned to have biases. And yeah, I think that's a good point. Does anyone else have anything?
Yeah,
yeah, Talisa, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So I absolutely agree with Randall that I want people to come with, their perspectives and things, but to echo what Lynn said, sometimes the biases impact the way they receive me as a Black female and the distributor of knowledge, in the classroom. So I'm really great and confident with doing that face-to-face because you can feel it when it comes up, because, if they turn away or they're uncomfortable when I'm talking about race or crime or whatever, I feel that. and I can address it, right? Not necessarily trying to get them to shed it, but just address it. Let's talk about it. I don't know what that looks like online at all.
It could be that it's coming through in the written communication that they have too, and you know, the interactions that students have online, they've got a little bit more time to think. So if we prompt them to think about their biases when they answer and respond, that could be part of their process of participation, right? So that they're thinking not only of the answer, but also too, like, how is my experience and my biases, how is that going to affect my answer too? Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, it does. I'm sorry. Whoever was talking, I'm sorry to cut you off. I guess my thing is, like, when you want the different perspectives, right? I feel like I do a good job in the classroom of enabling people to feel confident enough to have that conflict because I'm there as a mediator.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I'm slightly concerned that, like, on a discussion post or something, maybe the super confident people will share their different perspectives, or they'll be so nervous about a screenshot, right? So that, because that's happened on campus, right?
Yeah.
People have written things or been recorded without, you know, them knowing about their differences in thought, and it gets turned into an article on the Chronicle, right? So I'm kind of concerned. I want that too, for various reasons, but I'm concerned with how that plays out in a healthy, kind of safe space type way.
What are the things that you do in your in-person class? Not to put you on the spot, Talisa.
No, that's okay.
What are the things that you do for your in-person course?
Yeah, so particularly when I teach race, I start out, you know, so how do you describe yourself, right? I'm a teacher, I'm a woman, an auntie, right? So I list these things, I have them list those things, and then we flip it and I say, okay, well, how would people externally identify you, right? Because no one knows I'm an aunt when they look at me, right? And so that just gets them thinking, like, you know, what's your privilege, right? You can be privileged because you're Christian and the calendar aligns with your holidays, or, you know, different things that people wouldn't think about, and kind of just continuously bring these things up in the classroom. But you can feel the space. I'm saying that's the difference. I could have those things happen, but, you know, people, I don't know, maybe it is the same kind of engagement. I just don't have the practice with teaching online, but I know that I really just thrive off of the feeling when it happens in class. You see what I'm saying? I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but.
No, yeah. I think that when we're in person, we can see different reactions from people, and we can gauge the emotions that are being felt. Body language is a big thing that we're perceiving, and we don't have that. That's online. That's removed. I think it's a challenge for sure. I don't know that I have a really good answer for you. I'll be honest. I don't know that I have a really good answer. I think probably it will be something that you will develop that perception teaching online, just by doing it more and more. And, you know, if anyone else has any perspective on that too, you know, I don't want to say that I have all the answers, because I certainly don't.
Yeah, but I would second what Kim just said too. I think that these sorts of, well, they will look different online, these sorts of dynamics, whether it's synchronous, whether it's asynchronous on a discussion board or in a Zoom meeting. Those sorts of things are going to take a slightly different shape in an online environment, just because everything does. And so I think that it also, your managing of those sorts of situations or reactions to those sorts of situations are also a skill that could develop over time, as you get used to the modality a little bit. But yeah, I'm with Kim. I've been doing online webinars and workshops and things like that, and I've taught before previously online, and I don't know that I have a definitive answer for how to address these.
Two things that I thought of here: defining what it means to be a good participant in the online course at the beginning. You know, how we have that slide of different guidelines that we provide for you. That's a good strategy.
For a discussion board too, if I can interrupt real quick, you can have sort of an etiquette
guidelines page.
Yep. And then how we talked about the introductions where they have to have a picture or some personally identifiable information will make them feel like, it will feel more like they are interacting with someone in front of them. Because when, there's a phenomenon that I talked about, the social disinhibition, when we feel anonymous online, we say things that maybe we wouldn't ever say out loud to another person to their face. I know that those are not like solutions, but I think they're possible mitigation measures on that. Yeah, I'm gonna do Samuel. I'm gonna go to Samuel.
Hey everyone, thank you so much. Kind of circling back to what Kim just said, one of the things that I encounter frequently, because I teach disability studies, is, I think wherever student backgrounds are coming from, a lot of students actually don't have a lot of history discussing disability in particularly nuanced ways. So this issue around biases come up quite a bit, not least because I myself am a person with a non-visible disability. So that's something that I strategically discuss in class at different points throughout the semester when we're talking about these sorts of issues and biases about labor capacity and other sorts of things. But one of the ways I really help set up that conversation, whether it's digitally or in a synchronous online session, is at the beginning of the semester, we have kind of threading back to Kim's comment about netiquette, community norms. And one of the ways that I help re-encounter these sort of moments of bias as they come up is then to fall back on these sort of community norms. What are the ways that we mutually agreed on that we would discuss or handle a moment where a student says something that another students think is hurtful? How do we talk about disagreements in the classroom space? Particularly around identity-based language, you're not just dealing with a fact, right? You're also dealing with someone's personal lived experience. So you can't sort of treat it as or at least I don't necessarily think it's effective to treat it as just an emotionless thing. So having that previous conversation actually helps students, not only participate in the ways that they know are appropriate to the community, but B, it actually also helps student to student, not necessarily policing, but student to students then in their responses have a toolkit to be able to fall back on and say, oh, that's not actually how we have thought about this previously in class, or those types of shaping questions that you might say, tell me more, why would you say that? Or how do you mean? You find students offering those types of feedback in a discussion board where you may or may not want to be actively producing your own responses. I know Ashley had mentioned she tends to be quieter on discussion boards. So having that previous conversation helps me be able to do that kind of labor, but I also think it sets students up with their own toolkit to have those in-group conversations or other types of ways that when you're not necessarily there to actively guide the question, but you are still engaging with issues that may or may not be difficult, either discussion, contextually, intersectionally, something might be obvious or not obvious, as Talisa was saying.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Samuel. That's the idea of having students create their own kind of guidelines for community interactions is a very powerful experience for them to decide what it means to be, a good online participant in this specific way in this class that we have. I think helps a lot with the interactions that they have too. Yeah, awesome. Thank you for sharing. Sherry. Hi, Sherry, we can't hear you. There we go. Yeah, hi.
Good morning. Okay, thanks for recognizing me. I just wanted to say that I think that in the beginning too, it's very important, how when you establishing your learning goals, that you establish kind of like what perspective, you're coming from in this class. And so I think that helps because, addressing issues like race and gender, particularly when you're a faculty and you're a female faculty of color, it does raise some issues that, are going to be uniquely specific to you. And so I think that, Talisa makes some good points about, what does this look like? I too myself, kind of feel like I'm pretty good about picking up on body language and being able to address that. So I think that it's really important, like how in the beginning we were stressing, your learning outcomes and the importance of being transparent in that. I think that also in that now is a good time to think about, how you can, strengthen, your learning outcomes, your syllabus, the language, your mindset and how you interact with your students to make it more, I think, equitable, because I think is really now in the beginning is really important when you start to kind of like be transparent in the perspective that you're coming from. So like if you're a critical scholar, we're going to you use action verbs, like we're going to critique this, those types of things where people are really clear in understanding what you're going to do. And I think that it's also important that, you initially say that you understand that, these conversations are kind of challenging or difficult, but you normalize it. Like someone said, you have to name these things in the beginning. Someone talked about naming them. This is another issue that you have to name this and kind of normalize the importance of, having these difficult, that the scenario might be difficult, but that you're going to work through it, together. So I think that, again, so when we were talking about learning outcomes in the beginning, I was thinking about, issues of equity too need to be addressed and named in the beginning, and so I think that it's just something that we need to be able to start with in the beginning to try to help to better navigate, these situations. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. Absolutely. I think that is very important to start from the very beginning, to have these conversations and to set kind of the, I don't want to, it sounds like weird, like terms of engagement though, like what does it mean to be a student in this space? And what is it? And then how can you bring in your own experience in a way that is, aligns with the expectations in the course as well? Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, Todd.
I mean, I'm hearing a natural tension between sort of promoting discussion of differences based on experience and sort of political attitudes, while at the same
time how are you?
Meaning a great respect for, openness to diversity, right? In how we teach and who we are as instructors and as students, and, how the world is and how it should be. But so it seems to me the question is, with online, it is more difficult to navigate, at least for the uninitiated, as in person. If we have some empathy, or even training, we can figure out how to respond to these, we can feel them. Online, it is more difficult. And specifically, a couple of questions come to mind. There was discussion about whether we should have students post photos of themselves, which I think may be good. On the other hand, some of them may not want to. I would even require, if possible, I mean, I don't know what the vibe is of this, but I mean, what the sense of how this would affect students' receipt of knowledge and participation in the class. But I would ask them to, if it's a synchronous class, it should be video, everyone should have the video on. Now, I personally, in this class, understand there are moments when I'm going to get coffee, or, I mean, to be honest, when I'm checking my, other email and I don't want to necessarily be on video. How do we do this? I mean, how much disclosure do we want from students about these questions and issues, and how much anonymity or comfort should we let them preserve?
I have seen, so for students, to respond to the question about students who are worried about posting their picture in the class, I have seen a professor who said, pick 3 photos that you think represent yourself. And so, the student doesn't necessarily have to post a picture of their face per se. They could have a picture with them and their dog, or them and at the beach, or just the beach, or their dog, or whatever. So I think that puts the choice for the student, it gives them the choice, but you're still creating this identity online that students are able to control. And then the next question about the synchronous part with the video, it helps to be able to see the other person. However, I would caution against requiring the video because some people's internet might not be up to speed. Honestly, I am amazed that my internet is totally fine right now. It usually drops for me all the time. And so, it increases the requirements on the Wi-Fi connection when you have everyone's video on. Does it help? Yes. But in terms of accessibility and technology issues, it's something to consider on that. I think that this is a really important conversation that is something that we need to think about from the very beginning, which I think we are, right? Like our classes haven't started. We're having these conversations, trying to figure out what this looks like in the online space. Ashley and I have ideas, but we don't have all the answers. And we really appreciate you all bringing your own strategies and experiences and knowledge to this, because it really, I feel like this is a conversation that we need to have, right? Like that we are doing our best in the online space. And if we can work towards, doing the work that we were doing in person to our online classes, then this is a good place to be in, I think. And I don't have all the answers. And so I really appreciate you all sharing your own.
I agree with what Kim said. So again, these are really important conversations to have, and I think we have had a good one, but I hesitate to be the only answer. So I'm glad that you guys pitched in and shared your thoughts too. All right. Okay, so sorry guys, I'm having a lot of trouble with the slides today. Here we go. So these are just some quick examples of different ways to think about the flows of communication that Kim was talking about earlier. Some examples of different ways to get your students engaged. We're going to talk this afternoon more about different tools to use and how the different tools available to you might do different things for your students and for you and for the course. But so here are some different ways to think about engagement. So we've got quizzes, we've got a question board or a water cooler board, and the discussion forum can be a good way to get students just sort of chatting with each other or sharing something they found interesting or asking you a question that they might otherwise not do. Sometimes these types of boards can be a little bit underutilized, but one way that you could try to get students to use them is start it off and then get them hopefully going and using those things. You've got different ways through Blackboard that you can check on sort of student activity with the different materials and different tools that you're building in. So there are reports that you can run within Blackboard to check on the number of clicks that certain things are getting or where students are spending their time in the course. You can do wikis like we have done as well with you guys. You can do quiz questions via that kind of interject into a PowerPoint or interject into a lecture video if you like. So there are a number of different things. I think sometimes people think about engagement in terms of on an online course, because this is what we did in the spring, as basically a Zoom meeting or a Collaborate meeting, a synchronous session. But there are a lot of other ways to get your students engaging with each other, engaging with you, engaging with the content, and engaging with their own reflective learning process using tools that are asynchronous as well, and kind of getting them moving around within their Blackboard course and with the content and doing different types of activities. So we are going to show you guys an example. So we've talked about engagement, we've talked about assessment today, we've talked about aligning everything. Yes, Todd, you have your hand raised?
Yes, I'm sorry. You talked about Blackboard. Blackboard might not be continued as our default service. Is that, I mean, do you know if Blackboard will be the default service we will be using in the fall? I heard about contract with other vendors, but on the other hand, the other question is, even if it is, it seems that, you know, it's frankly, I mean, it's not as good as some of the other possibilities. I mean, do you have any comment about using alternative platforms?
So I work for the e-learning office in the library. So my answer is that it may not be everybody's preferred option, but it is the best option we have. And in terms of security of student work, so I know some faculty members have tried using like Facebook before, or only working on Google and these sorts of things. They don't have the same sort of internal security as a Blackboard course does, because a Blackboard course is only available and only visible to the students that are registered for that course. And there's no kind of external stuff that can be seen or taken out of that course. It's basically just you and just your students within that area. And so the security concerns with something outside of that are a little bit worrying. So Blackboard is going to be the platform that we have for summer, for sure. There is a process going forward to investigate other options, but nothing has been signed, no contracts have been made. So our contract is with Blackboard for the time being. All right. Okay, so we have a practice activity now for you guys. We're going to take a look at a real life example of a course that was taught by my predecessor. So she was the previous instructional designer with the library with e-learning, and she taught a geography course online. And so this is sort of her progression of different types of assessments that she had created for her geography course in an attempt to increase student engagement and increase the alignment with the outcomes, and putting all of the pieces together that we talked with you guys about today. So it is a little bit silly or a little bit fanciful, but you may have noticed that Kim and I like to have fun, and Kim and I always argue that you can still be having fun and be a little silly and still be doing a rigorous academic activity with your students. So hang on, we're going to go for a ride here. I'm going to describe a little bit about what the course is and the types of students, and then we're going to take a look at the original assessment that the professor had created. So it is a gen ed course on the geography of North America. And because it is a gen ed course, the majority of the students who are taking it didn't really want to be there. So most of them were taking it to, you know, quote, check a box and get some sort of requirement for their university degree or for their education. So there are some people who are really interested just because maybe they think geography is cool, but the majority of the people are not necessarily enrolled in this course for any kind of internal motivation, as Kim was talking about with the internal external motivation. And the delivery method is fully online, and it is a fully asynchronous course. So students are doing all of the course activities, all of the engagement with the course material and with each other in their own time, not in a real-time synchronous session. So here are the course learning outcomes from the instructor. So the goals or the outcomes, the skills that students should be able to do: define major physical geography terms related to North American geography, describe these geographical terms as they relate to specific ecoregions, compare different ecoregions and their specific landforms, climate, and geomorphic processes, and evaluate the inclusion or exclusion of certain ecoregions in North America. So it's an introductory course, as you can tell sort of from the different action verbs that are used in these outcomes and the different tasks and behaviors students are going to be able or be asked to do, right? So it's sort of lower order thinking skills, things like defining, describing, comparing, and a little bit of evaluation or analysis kind of at the end. So this here is the original assessment that a student who took this course was going to be able to do, or was going to be asked to do. So the delivery method, the original one, was an online test administered through Blackboard, where students were asked to define different terms related to the geography of North America. So you've got the different terms here, so landforms, soils, vegetation, etc. And the question types were short answer questions, multiple choice questions, and matching questions on this online test. So taking a look at this assessment in comparison to the outcomes we just went over, what do you guys think? Do you think it's well aligned with the outcomes? Let's see in the chat, do we have any answers? So here are the outcomes again. So defining major terms, describing the geographical terms related to specific ecoregions, comparing regions, or evaluating the inclusion or exclusion of certain ecoregions. So we've got a test where students are defining major terms related to geography of North America. Yep, I've got a vote for yes in the chat box. Any other votes? Mm-hmm. 2 votes for yes in the chat box. So yes, basically, it's not necessarily measuring every outcome, right? So you can't always get an assessment that's going to measure every single outcome all at one time, which is part of the reason why we have multiple types of assessments in a course. So yeah, so most people are saying about the first one. The first one seems pretty well aligned with this particular type of test.
When looking at the flows too, so what flows are here? So the flows, the possibilities are student to student, student to content, student to instructor, and student to self. I would say that it is probably student to content, maybe student to instructor, though there's not a lot of dialogue here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've basically got a test that sort of is taking a narrow view of one outcome in the course, and then also not necessarily expanding upon all of the possibilities for students to engage with this course. All right, so Kim's going to talk about different tweaks that the instructor made. First one and then another option.
The instructor was really bored with receiving the tests and looking at kind of the essays. And so she wanted to challenge herself to come up with a different option for students. So she scrapped the exam idea. And so she wanted to make this a little bit more interesting for her to read. I think that we often think about our students, or we should think about our students when we're planning our online courses, but I think logistically too, and what we're interested in could be a factor in the decisions that we make for our own courses and the things that we, inform our decisions here. So this is now an assignment. So instead of it being an exam, it's an assignment. And so this map was presented, the ecoregions map with the different colors, and the students were asked to choose an ecoregion. They had to identify and describe the landforms, geomorphic processes, soils, climates, and vegetation types that characterize the selected ecoregion. And then, does your ecoregion support or challenge the idea of the US and Canada as a distinctive geographic region that does not include Mexico? Why or why not? And so let's look at the flows first. So student to student, student to content, student to instructor, student to self. It's probably the same. I'd say it's student to content because they're having to interact here, and maybe student to instructor here only because the student is submitting this information to the instructor. I hesitate to say that it's a student to instructor relationship because there's no dialogue here. So the feedback part of this could be a student to instructor flow. The flows are not just one directional either. The flows are bidirectional too. Okay, so also too, learning outcomes. Does it do an all right job of the learning outcomes here? So choose, identify and describe, and then the ecoregion inclusion. Yeah, I see some yeses. I see a nod too. Yeah, Lynn, that's a good question with the student to self. So the student to self are like those reflective exercises, those metacognitive exercises. The reflection on, you know, why did you choose this ecoregion over another could be that student to self, focusing on the process, not necessarily the product of that. Yeah, this one's a little bit more challenging to make a student to self though. Cool, okay, awesome. All right, so the professor still was like, I feel like I can do better. I feel like I'm reading the same thing over and over again. And so this is where the fantasy comes in. I just want to say that this is an extremely fantastical assignment, but hopefully you'll see the fun in it and also the rigor as well. Okay, so the professor decided to change it and decided to have the delivery method change and the prompt change. So this is now a zombie preparedness assignment. So the students had to review a doomsday infographic that the National Geographic put out about what kinds of things that you would possibly need in the event of a zombie apocalypse. This was right at the heyday of like The Walking Dead and things like that. So it's a little bit of a dated example, I feel like, at this point, but still. So the students were asked to look at the doomsday infographic. They were then supposed to choose a ecoregion from the map, and they had to justify why they chose that based upon the geographic and geomorphic things and the things that they had studied throughout the semester. They had to describe it using terminology that they had examined throughout the course of the semester. And then they had to cite the suitability of it using this information. So they had to submit that as an assignment, and then they had to go to the discussion board where then they would debate whether or not the decisions that they made were sound enough. So I will say that the instructor chose to have this assignment and the previous assignment where they had the essay. She had 30 people in her class and gave them the option, you can either do one or the other. And 28 students chose to do the zombie preparedness one. And she said that the engagement from students was incredible. She had to, in future semesters, put a page limit on it because students were just going on and on about the decisions that they were made, the thought processes that they were doing. They had a really fun time with it. She said that she got very different submissions from everybody. So, you know, she had students who said, well, I think my hometown would be a really good choice because of the, you know, elevation of it or the natural barriers or whatever, using this geographic, you know, terminology and knowledge that they had acquired here. And then she had another student who said, no, I'd rather just be a zombie because all these geographic, you know, geomorphic locations and things wouldn't be an issue for me. Like I could scale walls and run or whatever. So this is quite fantastical, but students took it very seriously. And the responses that the professor got were very rigorous and clearly evidence of their involvement with the material here. So flows here, we've got student to content for sure. We also have student to student now with the introduction of the discussion board. So we've got a little bit more back and forth between students. So some students were like, oh, I didn't even think about that. That's really smart. Like, can I join you in that area or whatever? Or like, no, that's a poor decision because, you know, what about the exposure on the west side due to the whatever? Like they were, you know, going back and forth on that. So the student engagement was really high. As Ashley mentioned, the level of interest at the beginning of the course in geography was very low. And the professor saw an increase in geography as evidenced by switching to a geography major, which I thought was really interesting. And they said, so when she said, why would you change your major? And they said, because this made me realize that there are lots of applications of geography that are not just like, oh, there's a mountain range over there. So it's quite a fantastical example. Not every kind of reevaluation for the online space needs to be as fantastical. Definitely factor in your interests and your kind of expertise or anything like that. You know, you don't have to make it be like, oh, you're a financial officer in a theater during the zombie apocalypse. Like, no, that's not what we're saying here. It's just what the professor tried to do was to make this something that took an abstract concept, abstract things that they had looked at, and put them a little bit closer to their own experience, or this, like, in this hypothetical sense. So she helped with the value part. So students started to see, oh, there's practical applications to what we're talking about here. Giving the students the choice helped with the self-efficacy. So if they believed that they could do better on the essay part, they did the essay part. But if they wanted to do the zombie one, they could do that here. And the support part was a journey throughout the entire semester here. Does anyone have any comments on that?
Yes, may I say something, Kim?
Yeah, come on, go ahead.
Ashley, you know, this is really an interesting sort of way of sort of putting together a course that is knowledge-based. Would there be a difference between a knowledge-based course, such as this one, and one that is really based on skills, or that gives you a certain kind of skills to achieve? So the question of knowledge-based versus skilled courses. What would you do differently if you were thinking about putting together a skill course, for example, as compared to this one? Highly sophisticated, very creative, very innovative in terms of teaching and learning. What do you guys think? How about you, Ashley, as well, please?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Sure. I think that any sort of, if you're talking about blooms, which we did yesterday, and anything up on the top of that stairs graphic, the sort of things leading to creation, to analysis, to evaluation, to designing things, I think all of those sorts of things can take into account this sort of engagement. Right? So if you're thinking about this, this is sort of based on knowledge, but there are a lot of valuable skills that students are using for this particular assessment as well. So they're talking about collecting data that is valid data. They're going to have to sufficiently argue a position, which is a little bit harder of a writing task than just describing something. Right? They're going to have to analyze something based on the data that they found. So there are important skills going on in this sort of thing too. And so I think in kind of flipping it, if you had a course that was based more on the sort of higher order thinking skills, you can incorporate some of this sort of activity as well. Do you want to add anything, Kim?
We have other examples of real assignments that people have used and crafted that kind of demonstrate their own kind of journey throughout looking towards more student engagement in the online space. But we don't want to give those to you yet because we want to see what you come up with as well. But we do have some examples of previous ones, for sure. Yeah.
All right. But first, we're going to give you guys a chance to work in groups a little bit. So we haven't had any group work yet today. So we asked everybody to bring a copy of their own assessment from one of their online or courses that are going to be online to this workshop today, to this session. And so we're going to have you guys take the assessment that you brought with you, work in small groups. We're going to make them a little smaller than yesterday. So maybe 3 or 4 people in a group, and really sort of brainstorm on it, sort of workshop this particular assessment that you brought or that you've used before. So we want you to keep your learning outcomes in mind. If you've revised them since yesterday, we got a couple emails and saw in the chat box and comments today that some people already have revised their learning outcomes. So if you've revised them, maybe how would that affect the execution of this particular assessment? Think about the different flows of communication and collaboration. So if it's just one, are there possibilities for opening up more flows of communication with this particular assignment to make it fit within the online environment and to increase student engagement in the particular task? So Kim, do you have the breakout rooms ready to go?
Yep, hold on.
Okay, cool. So Kim is going to give you guys kind of alerts. We were thinking maybe you could spend like 3 to 5 minutes on each person's different assignment and kind of brainstorm together. And Kim will send out alerts through the system to let you know when it's time to switch so everybody can get a chance.
Yeah, the critical part of this here is that everyone has an opportunity to be able to talk. So please be respectful of each other's time. We've got not as much time as you know, for a full conversation of all of your assessments. But if you just, you know, present it and then go, that would be best, because we want to make sure that you've got some time here. All right, I'm gonna give you probably 2 or 3 minutes per person. So quick, all right? All right, come on back. Welcome, welcome. Hello, hello, welcome back, welcome back. All right, so looks like everyone's coming back now, which is good. Welcome back. All right, so hopefully you had some time to discuss with your colleagues the kind of ideas that you had for your own assessment, maybe how to flip it for the online space particularly, or how to make it a little bit more engaging given the discussions that we had about motivation as well as the different flows. So, you know, if you want to talk to either Ashley or me about your assessment and what plan you had, let us know. I will be here probably for another half an hour after 11, so we can continue to talk about that. I'm gonna eat lunch at 11:30 though. Thank you all again. The group breakouts are really fun, right? Like you get to talk with your colleagues in a different way. I think that that's really nice to be able to do that too.
Yeah, we also get a chance to get to know one another too, because we
right.
don't see these people on campus.
Right,
Exactly.
right. And then hopefully, you know, you've got other people that you can talk to too as we move forward with the summer, and then maybe about, you know, in the fall, if you're going to be teaching online in the fall, either by, you know, mandate or otherwise. We have a very large community of online instructors already. So for the online instructor course, we've got about 500 people now who've gone through that course successfully. So, you know, you're joining this really engaging, already very large, robust community here, who you can trade ideas with and things like that. So before we close out here, I wanted to give some examples of real assignments that people have come up with and used successfully in their own classes. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly though. So the first one is translation audiences. There was a professor who was teaching a translation class, a Spanish translation class, and she would normally give her students a translation article and say, okay, translate this. But what she ended up doing was she had a discussion board, and every single person was given the same translation but was assigned a role to translate as, so for the audience. So One was for the medical community, one was for the experts in the field, one was for high school students, and another one was for children. So those were, the way that you translate it would have to be different for those. And so then they talked about why, what decisions they made and how they made those. The sexuality ads was for a intro to sociology course, and the students were asked to find ads in newspapers or YouTube videos or whatever that spoke to a specific topic that they were talking about that related to sexuality in their discussions. And this was a student to self-flow, student to content and student to self-flow, because it was a journal. So the students put that in a journal and they said, this is what I thought of, and this was the decisions that I was making. So thinking about the process and not necessarily the product only. All right, the financial officer in a theater, that was an assignment that was given as a final project, so a summative assessment, and the course was about managing a theater financially, essentially. And so it was a situation. So in the second to last week of class, they were given a situation and they were the financial officer in a theater. And then in the last week, they were then given like an extension of that story. And then they were asked to say, okay, how would your decisions change based upon the relationships that were there? National Security Advisor was a professor asked their students to write a brief on a particular national security situation for the Department of Defense, or like that kind of audience. And this was someone who was coming from the professional world, and so they knew and had a lot of information about, like, okay, you don't have 12 pages to say this, you only have a page, and it needs to be this, and it needs to look like this, and it needs to include this. And so trying to encourage them to be brief while still being comprehensive. This one, Hobbes and the Stateless Society, was an intro to philosophy class, and the professor had the students write based upon their own experiences, what would they think a stateless society would look like, so a society without a government. And then, so they wrote that, and then they read Hobbes, and then they had to pretend that they were Hobbes responding to their own post. So, trying to find loopholes and things, or breaking down the argument that they had originally posted as Hobbes. And then there was another professor for an asynchronous class that had a truancy debate. And so she assigned roles for each student about, what are the things that would affect a student who wasn't showing up to class. Like, what are the things, so one person was their parent, one person was the school board, another person was the teacher. And so like looking at that in a K-12 situation. So it's, all of these examples are not as fantastical as zombies, right? But they are really authentic in real world. So the National Security Advisor one, that could be something that they're asked to do in the future. So you're giving them the space, time, and support to be able to experiment now and be able to encounter these things that you're asking them to do before they're asked to do them in a job or in some other class or whatever. So you're just building a foundation there. All right, so the final block is today from 2 to 4. We're going to talk about the different tools. You'll notice that we have been very intentional in not talking about the tools yet. We want to have all of the things ready to go before we start talking about the tools, because the tools are ancillary to the things that the decisions that you make with the course design. They will enhance it, but they should not guide the decisions that you make. So it should be, okay, I have these learning outcomes, I have these kind of assignments and assessments, and then these are the instructional strategies that will help them get there. What's the optimal tool to use? We're going to also show you what a sample online course looks like and is organized. And Ashley, do you have anything to add for that?
I've got a couple examples that I can show. So we have, well, you'll see when we get there, but basically I have 3 examples of online courses to show you, different ways that they can be organized. And then also, I think I mentioned this yesterday, but I'll say it again, we enrolled all of you into a Blackboard course that is called, I think it's just called the Online Course Design Intensive. And as a student. And so you can see a sample online course template in there. You don't necessarily have to organize your class that way, but if you're sort of trying to think about, okay, I've got all these design ideas and I'm revising, excuse me, my syllabus and all of these things, but how do I take that step and what does that look like when I build it into Blackboard? You can take a look and poke around at that template, and it's got a lot of good information for you. And it serves as another example as well.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for a good block again. We've had a lot of really good discussions here. Go have some lunch. Go take a break. If you've got any ideas for us or if you have any questions for us, let us know. I'll continue to be here for a little bit. And you can ask questions if you want.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you. Have a good break.
Thank you, Bob and Kristen.
Thank you, Kim and Ashley.
Afternoon.
Bye.
You're welcome. Thank you, guys.
I have a question for you.
I also have a question, but I'll wait.
Okay.
So I show an activity to my group, and they gave me some nice suggestions. So I wonder, or at least I can mail it to you and see what they suggested.
Sure.
Yeah. And this is statistics class, so it's another issue. And then I sent you a question, a private question, I think, to you, Kim.
Yeah.
Because this is very fast, right? Of course, because it's just to get us started, but I probably would like to train better. So I might register for the one if there is room.
There's a lot of overlap between the intensive now and what you will do in the instructor course. If you feel like you want, or if you feel like you have more time to dedicate to developing your online class, then sure, then absolutely. You might find it to be a touch repetitive. But if you're fine with that, then I'm fine with that. I want to make sure that you understand, kind of how we come up with this.
Yeah. Okay, all right. So I'll see you this afternoon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
But I need to send a message to Geraldine, Candy.
I think we had one more question.
Yeah, that was actually my question, building on what Olga said, and that is, I've signed up for the 2 courses, but I mean, if it is going to be repetitive, this has been absolutely outstanding. So I would rather, take myself out and make the room for someone else if that's an option, because I mean, I'll be happy to take the second one, but I don't want to occupy space, so to speak. If because you can only, even if it is asynchronous, you can only oversee that many students. I mean, there's a limit of students you can be overseeing, readings, work, and stuff like that. So
yeah, because I think maybe because we are all so excited to be here, and we know it's short, so I don't know if we can.
Did you sign up for the other one, Olga?
I haven't, but I might.
I can yield my space to Olga. I'm willing to do that, because I have enjoyed thoroughly.
They may have a waiting list, but
so I'll be happy to kind of withdraw and yield my space to her if she needs it more.
We have been able to figure out and recruit more people to manage or to have different sections of the course. It will feel very similar, so there is no wait list anymore. We have Ashley and I have some really wonderful colleagues who are helping with this, and who have a lot of knowledge as well that they bring to the conversation too. So Christian, if you want to take the full version, then absolutely, we'd love to have you. And, Olga, it wouldn't be necessarily that you'd be an addition here. It would be something that we could absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because I saw a wait list at one point, and and so okay, so that's great. That's wonderful. No, you guys are absolutely outstanding, and I'm learning a great deal, and I enjoy this very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, my practical questions are, because I did sync after knowing my students for 2 months, so it went well, okay? But now it's going to be asynchronous, right?
Yeah.
For me. So how much? Because I wonder, because I saw some of my colleagues who were not doing in sync the last 2 months, they were recording and recording and recording. And I wonder how much, is there any data that tells me how much the student watch videos? And then because in fairness to all, if their connections are not good, should I always have in something, a document in writing that captures what is on the video? Because not everybody will be able to probably watch a video and do a quiz on the video itself if the internet connections are not strong. So I have my question about how much. Also, the video thing, because my courses, there are some good videos out there that I can pitch and probably post a link, watch this, and probably they will not watch. Why they don't read the text? I know they don't read the text, but why will I assume that they watch a video?
So couple of responses to that. So they've looked at videos and how long people end up staying and watching a video, and it's that people have a significant drop off after about the 6-minute mark. And so because of this, the recommendation is that the video be on the shorter side. 6 to 8 minutes, I'd say, is probably optimal, so that, we're trying to catch them before they drop off on that. I think the in-person challenge of encouraging our students to read the textbook and do the readings and watch the videos is the same kind of issue that we have in the in-person class. The advantage that we have, though, here is that we can have prompts and things that direct them towards, how can you answer this question well if you haven't done the content, if you haven't interacted with the content, right? And we're hearing from every single person, which is a huge advantage. I can't stress that enough in the online space. So we're making sure and checking in with our students with these formative assessments to make sure that they're doing the reading here. We can encourage them, but we can't make them. Do we have an advantage? I'd say advantage goes to the online space, particularly in the asynchronous one. Yeah. Let's see. Betsy. We'll go with Betsy. Hi.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. My question is, I'm doing a semi-synchronous weekend class for the summer. It's just 2 full Saturdays, so 1 credit class, and I plan on having half the class, half of that day synchronous, and then the rest of my content asynchronous. Anyway,